back in September 2019, I ended up meeting up with a girl in the comments section of a Facebook post. She was really pretty and seemed really cool, so after a few weeks of talking, I decided to drive all the way from White Plains to Pittsburgh just so we could hang out for a weekend. I remember a friend asking something to the effect of, "Have you talked to her much on the phone?" And I told him we'd spoken a little, but that we'd mostly talked via text and Facebook Messenger. And he recommended that we talk in long form and about a lot of different stuff too. Otherwise, I might get a nasty surprise. Well, I guess he was right. And now I won't bore you with all of the details, but let's just say me and this girl weren't nearly as compatible as I'd hoped. And then while I'd originally planned on staying the whole weekend so me and her could get some food, maybe catch a movie, I decided to just cut my losses and drive back to New York on Saturday evening. I figured if I hit the road at around 7 p.m., I could be back home by around 1 the next morning. And no doubt I'd be exhausted by the time I got home, but not too beat that I'd risk getting into an accident or anything. So with my mind made up, that's what I did. After getting a quick bite to eat, I was on the 22 by 7:30, and then after 3 hours of driving with the setting sun in my rear view, I saw a sign for Rosecrans, PA. It had been dark for maybe 30 to 40 minutes, and I remember seeing a Sunoco gas station all lit up just off the highway to my left. Then just a mile or two up the road, and in timeless fashion, my gas gauge lit up with a low gas warning. Maybe that's just my luck, that it never lights up as I'm approaching a gas station, only ever when it's just a speck in my rear view. But I was also driving on one of those divided highways, the kind with a whole-ass miniature park between the two stretches of highway, and this obviously meant that there was no turning around for miles. And then I asked my phone, "Hey Siri, where's the next gas station?" And then my phone started talking about another gas station that I'd find if I turned onto US 15. I'd have to drive another 20 to 30 minutes or so, but it was there, and I wasn't about to run out of gas and get stranded like an idiot. And I remember checking the highway ahead of me and not seeing any other cars behind me or ahead of me, so I thought it was safe to actually look at my phone screen to make sure that I'd take the right turn. And I swear to God, I looked for no longer than 2 seconds at the most, and then when I brought my eyes back to the road, there she was, dead ahead of me. I slammed on my brakes, almost giving myself whiplash in the process, but I kept control of my car. The girl went from being a faintly lit shape on the furthest and dimmest reaches of my headlights to being only 5 feet in front of me. And while my first instincts were to yell, "Are you effing crazy?" at her, I quickly realized why she'd been walking in the middle of the highway. She looked to be in a bad way. Her clothes were all torn up, and there was blood in her hair from what looked like a head wound, and I didn't see it until she climbed into my passenger seat, but she wasn't wearing any shoes either. The moment my car stopped, she limped around to my passenger side and then tried to open up the door. I keep it locked out of habit, so her first attempt did nothing but make a dull wrenching sound, but that was soon followed by this blood-curdling screech of, "Open the door, I'm begging you, please!" I still had zero clue what was going on, so my first reaction was to spin around in my seat just in case who or whatever had hurt her was close by. I didn't open my car door right away, because obviously if I was going to carjack someone, using a pretty girl in distress as bait seems like a very effective tactic. But when I didn't see anyone, and when the girl gave me another very convincing cry of "please help me," I guess that seeing the blood up close and hearing the genuine terror in her scream, they kind of overrode my paranoia. Then after taking one final look at her, I unlocked my car, and she practically dove into the back seat before slamming the door closed behind her. And as I took off again, she says, "Mister, we need to move. We're not going fast enough. They're going to catch us." And so I put my foot down as I asked who they were. She said she didn't know. They just took her. And it was then that I noticed the handcuffs around her left wrist. One cuff was still locked around it, but the other just hung there awkwardly. I didn't need any more information other than that. I just put my foot down and burned rubber for a few miles till I thought that we were at a safe distance. I checked my rear view a few times, and then when I didn't see any lights, I slowed from around 70 to a pretty safe 35. But as we started to slow, the girl started yelling. And she says, "Why are you slowing down?" And before I could even answer, she says, "Go faster, what are you doing? They're going to be following me." I'm kind of freaking out internally, but I told her there was no one in sight. And we also wouldn't be going anywhere if a cop came the other way and caught us doing a buck and change. But then she says, "You don't get it. We want the cops. If those guys catch me, they'll kill you too." And I guess when you think about it, I didn't doubt that. If whoever she was talking about had been willing to handcuff her before trying to crack her head open, I have no doubt that they'd put a bullet in me to get her back. It was also kind of a relief to hear that thing about the cops too, because when I saw the handcuffs, there was a part of me that thought, Jesus, please don't accidentally be harboring a fugitive right now. But it wasn't the cops she was running from. I sped up a little, pushing things back up to 60 plus so we were moving without breaking any speed limits. And then I was checking my rear view every other second, expecting a pair of headlights to appear. And that's when I remembered my goddamn gas tank and how it was almost empty. As you can imagine, the girl was not excited when I told her that we needed to stop for gas at the next town. She didn't want to believe it at first, that the driver she thought was going to save her had a fuel gauge in the red, and she started freaking out in the passenger seat, screaming the F word over and over until I managed to talk her down. I put my foot down again, picked up some speed, and then told her to call the cops and tell them to meet us at that gas station that we were about to pull to. The girl grabbed my phone from the dash and called 911, and then over the next minute or so, I listened to what she said and got a little more info on what had happened. She didn't go into too much detail, but after telling the cops where we were going, she explained to the dispatcher that she'd been kidnapped, taken someplace out in the woods, then handcuffed to a metal pipe which she'd broken to get free. She said, "I don't know a lot, so I'm assuming in response to questions like who were they or where exactly are you right now." But I also learned that she'd been held for a couple of days by that point, and whoever had been holding her captive had done some disgusting and evil stuff to her. It was no coincidence that when she started detailing some of the stuff she'd endured, I noticed my speed gauge creeping up to 75. It was making my skin want to crawl off my bones just listening to the stuff those creeps did to her. And in my head, I guess I imagined them to look something like monsters. Little did I know, I'd be meeting them sooner than I thought. So we kept on speeding down the highway until we reached the turn that I'd read about, and then after maybe 5 more minutes of rolling through small-town Pennsylvania and sticking to the speed limit, we came to that gas station where we were supposed to meet the cops. But they were nowhere to be seen, and when she realized this, the girl started to freak out again. She started yelling at me, saying, "Where are they? They said they'd be here. Where are they?" And I tried to calm her down by explaining they were probably on their way. But this did nothing to keep her calm. For a few minutes, the girl sat in my passenger seat, watching a car pass here and there and getting super freaked out about who it might be. Then when a car pulled into the gas station and stopped at a pump, she says, "Screw this. I'm getting out of here." She then jumped out of my car and ran off onto the street behind the gas station and toward what looked like a thick patch of trees. Now, I screamed at her to wait, but she didn't even look back. She just kept on running in her bare feet, with that half a handcuff still dangling from one of her wrists. And then she was gone. My yelling attracted the attention of the guy who just pulled in to pump gas, and for a second, I thought that he might have been the guy the girl was running from. But when I told him everything was under control and the cops are on the way, he nodded quietly and returned to his vehicle. Since the girl was sure that she was being followed, I'd parked my car facing the whole gas station, not near a pump. But since the girl decided to run off and take her chances elsewhere, I figured that I'd do what I went there to do in the first place and actually fill up my tank. And so I got back into my car and drove around to the pumps and was opposite the guy that I'd talked to about calling the cops. Now at this point I'm just kind of reflecting on everything, but we swapped a little small talk about the girl and I explained how I'd picked her up on the highway, scared out of her mind. And he agreed it seemed like something really bad was going on. And then he wished me luck with the cops before he paid for his gas and drove off. But no sooner had he pulled out when another car came rolling into the station. It was a 4-door sedan, a pretty nice one too, and it pulled up to the pump just behind me. 3 men then got out, all real regular-looking guys, probably in their 40s or 50s, and then instead of pumping gas or walking over to the store to buy snacks, they started looking around the area like they were searching for something, or maybe someone. I'm keeping one eye on my gas pump and one eye on the guys that just pulled up, and then suddenly, the oldest of the 3 says, "Hey, you haven't seen a little lady walking around here, would you?" Now, I've always been a really bad liar, and I knew a straight no probably wouldn't pass with this guy, so when the older guy asked me if I'd seen her, I said yes. But then, instead of telling them the whole truth, I told them a version of it. I said that I'd seen a crazy-looking broad in the middle of the highway who'd tried to get me to stop. But since I was pretty sure she was about to try and carjack me, I kept my door locked and drove around her and sped off. I knew not to look him dead in the eyes, so I looked around him and his buddies and then asked, "Why? What's this about? She escaped from like a insane asylum or something?" And the 3 of them just sort of laughed, and I figured that I might have, sold them on my performance. But then as the older guy stayed in front of me, his 2 buddies started flanking me on either side, with one looking at my car and the other looking off in the direction that the girl actually ran. The older guy then suddenly asked me, "Did you call 911? And again, in what was a version of the truth, I told him I had. I didn't mention anything about arranging to meet the cops at that gas station. I just said that I called them because I was worried some crazy B-word was going to end up splattered on the highway, and some poor schmuck like me was going to end up going to jail over it. I'm not saying it was an Oscar-winning performance, but I tapped into some genuine emotion there. Yet no matter how convincing I thought I was, the guy's 2 friends weren't moved in the slightest, and one of them was now looking through my car windows, clearly looking for any sign of that girl. I think those were some of the scariest, most nerve-wracking moments of my entire life, praying that girl hadn't left anything behind on the passenger seat when she'd bolted, something like a scrunchie or maybe some of her clothing. I also got terrified that I left my phone on the dash and that the guy might see a blood smear or something on that from that girl. And so you can imagine my relief when I felt the weight of it in my pocket. I was at that point I decided to be a little aggressive. And I don't mean that in a sort of I tried to fight them way. It was almost like a normal person would want to know why their car was being inspected, and that's what I asked. I turned to the guy looking into my car, and was kind of rude and standoffish when I said something like, "Hey, what are you looking for, buddy?" And he looked at me, and started backing off away from the car with nothing but a smile. The older guy then said something to the effect of, "Don't mind my friend there, he's just a curious soul." Something really creepy like that, and then they made their excuses and moved on. As I went to pay for my gas, the 3 men were still walking around the gas station. They were doing it less urgently than when they'd first arrived, more subtly too, but they were still looking for that girl. I walked up and down in that store after paying for my gas, making out like I was just an indecisive snacker, and then a few minutes after, the 3 guys got back into that sedan and left. I then made myself some coffee, ate a few protein bars while I told the clerk that whole story, and then walked outside to meet the cops when they showed up maybe 20 minutes after I'd hoped they would. I repeated the story, included the part about the 3 guys showing up, and with added emphasis on how damned unnerving this all had been, like they had the girl fitted with a tracking device or something. And that sounded like a little too sci-fi for me at first, but the more I thought about that afterwards, the more it shifted into the realm of possibility. I know I was on a lonely stretch of highway, and at this point it was almost 11 p.m., but the fact those guys seemed to know exactly where to stop, which car she'd been in, and which direction she'd run off in, it makes me think that that might have just been the case. Even the cop that I spoke to agreed that if it was some kind of kidnapping situation, the girl could have been fitted with some kind of tracking device, most probably in the handcuffs that she was still wearing when she got into my car. And before he left, one of the cops thanked me for calling it in and added that even though it had been a stressful and potentially traumatic situation, getting the police involved was the right thing to do and meant that we were one step closer to bringing everyone involved to justice. And the guys chasing the girl had potentially made a huge mistake in getting their faces and license plate on the gas station's cameras. And if it was me that had led them there, I should feel proud of myself. It was pretty cool for him to say that and definitely made me feel a little bit better about this whole thing, but it was also just about the only thing that really did. Because all my other thoughts about it were dark and more dark, and they played out on the rest of the ride home too, which was a whole 3 hours of wondering what the hell had I almost gotten myself into. I got a call from a detective a couple of days later, and after retelling that story to him with as much detail as I could remember, I asked if the girl had been found. And according to him, they hadn't found anybody but the owner of the vehicle the men had traveled in, and that basically they were still trying to figure out what the hell was going on. The detective said if he needed to ask me anything else, he'd give me a call, but that was the last I heard from him, or any Pennsylvanian cop for that matter. And I still think about that girl every now and then. I wonder who she was, who those men chasing her were, and if she ever got far enough away from them that she wouldn't have to live scared anymore. But a part of me thinks that in the same way she wouldn't just give in, the same way she'd patiently engineered her own escape, those men chasing her won't give in so easily either, especially when she still has a voice to tell the truth about what happened to her. Some days, when I'm in a brighter mood, I like to think she got away, and that she's raising kids with a good man someplace with all that darkness being just a memory for her. But then other days, when I'm not feeling so swell, I get this bad feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I feel like I know they got to her, and that they shut her up for good. My name's Nick, and I'm from England. Back in the mid-90s, when our son was still only 4, we went on a family holiday to Tuscany in Italy. My wife had found this incredible villa in a holiday brochure, which was up in the hills above a place called Lucalena. It looked like a little slice of paradise, and it was shockingly cheap compared to some of the less rural villas and apartments. So without delay, we booked it for 2 weeks, paid the fees and deposit, then counted the days into our dream holiday. We landed in Pisa in the late afternoon, and while our young son Tom hated the flight, he loved the ice cream that we bought him before the journey out to Lucalena. It was a good 3-hour drive from Pisa, so by the time we were within maybe half an hour of Lucalena in our village, it was completely dark. We were right out in the countryside too, so the stars above us lit up the sky, and little Tom fell asleep after staring out the window at them. My wife was struggling to stay awake by the time we came to a crossroads, and I was pretty exhausted from the day's traveling myself. So rather than make a gut decision on which path to take, I stopped the car, got my map out, and consulted it before making the appropriate turn. I reassured my wife that we were only a few miles away and that we'd be at the villa within 15 to 20 minutes, and then I drove up a steep path that leveled off at the top. Because of the slope, I couldn't see what was at the top, so I made sure to crest the hill nice and slowly to avoid any kind of collision. But then, as I did, someone jumped out of the bushes at the side of the road and was lit up by my headlights. I could see that he had a long, double-barrel shotgun in his hands, and he was aiming it right at me. I slammed on the brakes as my wife started to panic. Then I was struggling to get the car in reverse when all of a sudden I heard, "No, no," from outside the car. A second man had jumped out of the bushes and was lowering the first man's shotgun while telling him no. They both shot us a look of horror, realizing we were not who they thought we were. Then the second man, who stopped the first from shooting, walked over to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass. When I rolled it down, he gave me and my wife this big nervous smile as he said, "Mi dispiace molto, signore," which I knew from my Italian phrase book meant, "I'm very sorry, sir." I didn't really speak much Italian, and what little I'd learned went right out the window when that guy pointed a shotgun at me, so all I could manage in reply was, "Parle inglés?" or "Do you speak English?" And the man said, "No, no," in that melodic, drawn-out Italian way, and then said, "No English, mi dispiace." I then heard my wife ask, "Are you police? Policia?" And the man replied, "Si, policia," with the same big smile on his face, and then told us, "Avanti, vai, vai," which just means, "Come on then, move along." And we both thanked him, and by that point, Tom had woken up in the back seat and was getting very agitated, asking, "Mommy, Daddy, who are these men?" And we told him it was the police, but they had been very friendly and were letting us go. I think my wife believed them at the time, so she was very convincing and reassuring Tom that there was nothing to worry about. But me, I didn't believe a word he'd said about being the police. I didn't say anything with Tom in earshot, and I didn't want to scare him, and arriving at the villa really took the edge off too, because it was even nicer in the flesh than it was in the brochure. But then, once we gotten Tom all tucked into bed and had a few moments to settle down, I told my wife what I'd been thinking. I told her how I didn't think those men were the police. They weren't in uniform. That shotgun looked like it had come off a farm, not from a police arsenal, and they didn't even attempt to show us any badges or identification or anything like that. And she asked me, "Well, if they weren't police, who were they?" And I replied, "The mafia." My wife just sat down in bed in silence as I made my case, and when I was done, it made sense to her too. A couple of mafiosos had been waiting to ambush someone, and they thought that person was us. The only thing that stopped us freaking out completely was that we were at least a couple of miles away from that ambush site, so the chances of running into them again seemed minimal. She suggested we call the police in the hopes they had an English speaker down at the station, but even if they did, I wasn't sure that was a good idea. The idea of rocking the boat like that made me feel even more nervous than having that shotgun pointed at me and my family, because while that whole thing had apparently been a mistake, having us snitching on the local mafia on our first day in Italy was a deliberate act that might well bring us some undue attention. I'm not saying it was an easy decision to make. I was furious that some idiot had pointed a gun at us, but it quickly became a question of, if we're going to be staying there for 2 weeks, what was the course of action that was going to keep us safest? And that's how we decided to honor that age-old mafia tradition of keeping our bloody mouths shut. The next day, we decided to walk down to Lusalena to do some exploring, and that's how we found this little bar that served paninis, espresso, and an assortment of little pastries. I got a coffee, and then while my wife and son got Cokes and played around with the table football set in the little games room they had, I sat at the bar and discovered the bartender actually spoke English. We talked back and forth, and he gave me some restaurant recommendations. Then suddenly, a group of older men who were drinking coffee and playing cards started gesturing toward the bar's television. The bartender turned up the TV, which was showing us a news report of some kind. I asked the bartender what it was about, and after listening to the news lady speak for a minute or so, he turned back to me and said, "There's been a murder, not far from here. This was a businessman who got killed. Terrible thing." I asked him exactly how far away the murder had been, and after consulting with some of the older men, the bartender confirmed my suspicions. It had taken place in almost the exact spot where those armed men had jumped out of the bushes ready to fire at us. I didn't rush to tell the wife. I didn't want to frighten her any more than she already was. But later that day, once we were back at the villa and getting ready to head out for dinner, I told her about the murder. Again, it wasn't like anything we could do about it, or rather, it was nothing we were willing to stick our necks out over by getting involved with local crime. The best thing we could do was try to forget about it, head to Lusalena and enjoy some incredible home-cooked food. It was so good that our young son Tom suddenly didn't mind trying new things when they were all so delicious. And so we ate our fill, and when we were all finished, we asked for the bill. The waiter then comes out with the restaurant's owner, and the pair of them explain in very broken English that the meal had already been paid for. Then when I asked who the generous person was, they explained that it was someone we'd had a misunderstanding with. At first, my wife and I didn't make the connection, and we tried explaining there hadn't been any kind of misunderstanding. We loved the food, and we wanted nothing more than to support their business by paying our bill. But the owner insisted. Our money was no good there. Then when we ate there again the second night, with every intention of leaving a large tip, they once again explained our food was free. But by then, we'd figured out who was paying for our meals. It was the mafia. It didn't happen anywhere else, and we made sure to visit plenty of other places because we felt terrible. I mean, as far as we knew, the mafia hadn't really paid for our food, and those poor people were being forced to cook for free. But then, every time we did eat there, they seemed really happy to see us, and the waiter would always bring our gelato for our 4-year-old son without us asking for it. My wife didn't always approve of all that ice cream, but you better believe Tom did. That made us think that maybe those mafia guys really were paying the owners for all our food, and that they were running a little scam of their own and giving us as much as possible so they could claim it all back from the mafia. But since we didn't see them ever again, I suppose we'll never know. They never reached out to us, and we didn't see those 2 armed guys around the village at all. But I suppose it was probably a case of they saw us, we just didn't see them. It was an amazing but very intense holiday. But the next time we visited Italy, we went to a completely different part of the country and had no repeat encounters with any nocturnal assassins. We had to pay for all our meals, which my wallet definitely wasn't thanking me for, but we still found that second holiday much more relaxing than the first.